Good evening. I warmly welcome you all to this year's Panofsky lecture with Professor Marisa from Yale University. Erwin Panofsky, the namesake of our visiting professorship at the Zentralinstitut for Art History in Munich, quite clearly favored painting, printmaking, and drawing compared to sculpture and architecture. Of course, that does not mean that Panofsky didn't write books on these artistic genres. His 1951 publication on Gothic architecture attempts to interpret it as an expression of a particular scholastic mode of thinking. And as early as 1924, Panofsky contributed a volume on German sculpture from the 11th to the 13th century to a multi-volume history of sculpture in Germany. His essays on Michelangelo always addressed sculpture, and in 1964, the last book Panofsky published during his lifetime was devoted to the topic of tomb sculpture. But, however, for someone who so strongly advocated iconography and iconology as method, it is surprising that Panofsky never produced a more extensive text on the topic of the political monument, which, quite fittingly, would later become a central field of study in political iconography research in Hamburg under Martin Warnke and others. Marisa has taken up exactly this question of political monuments in her most recent book, The Monument's End, Public Art and the Modern Republic, Princeton University Press, 2024. The book addresses the crisis of the monument from the later 16th century onward and focuses on the early modern Netherlands. It is there, for example, that the first public statue in honor of an intellectual hero, so to say, Erasmus, was erected. Central for Marisa's argument is the bronze statue of Don Pedro de Toledo, Duke of Alba, the most important general of the Spanish king, set up following a glorious military victory. However, the overly glory-seeking victor soon fell from royal favor, and the statue was dismantled and destroyed. While statue removals have always occurred, the dismantling of the Duke of Alba's monument can be considered the first instance in which such a removal was itself publicly celebrated and immortalized in a bronze medal and in print. From a historical perspective, Marisa's book thus makes a significant contribution to the current debate about the legitimacy of monuments. In 2019, Marisa published another book entitled Insect Artifice, Nature and Art in the Dutch Revolt, which links new forms of natural observation, representation, and the interest in insects and other small creatures with the political contexts of the Netherlands around and after 1600. And no less original is her third book from 2016, her first book, Jan Gossard and the Invention of Netherlandish Antiquity, which investigates the fundamental importance of the reception of antiquity north of the Alps and Gossard's pioneering role in it. Currently, Marisa is working on two new books, one entitled Flights, A History of Birds in Art, and the other is on Desiderius Erasmus and the Visual Arts, the Panofskyan topic par excellence, with Erasmus already playing a key role in the monument's end, thanks to his public statue I've mentioned. The close connection between Erasmus and Holbein the Younger also leads directly to the topic of our lecture this evening. But first, I would like to add that Marisa received her PhD in 2011 from Harvard University and that she has been teaching at Yale since 2016. I would like to thank Marisa for accepting our invitation to serve as Panofsky Professor for 2025 and for coming to Munich. And I would also and especially like to thank the friends and donors of the Zentralinstitut for Art History, the Conjuncta Florescit, for their generous support, which has enabled us to host a Panofsky Professorship and a Panofsky Fellowship at the ZI since the year 2016. as our current Panofsky Fellow, Stella Whiskrell, has recently completed her doctorate at the University of Cambridge, and she's working in Munich from May to July, conducting research on vision and self-knowledge in Emperor Maximilian's Fürstliche Chronik from 1518. But now I would like to invite you all to join me in warmly welcoming Marisa Bass, who will give a lecture on Holbein's margins, printed alliances in Renaissance Basel. Marisa.
Thank you so much, Ulrich, for that beautiful and generous introduction. And thank you all for being here this evening on a very hot day. At least it's cool inside. I also want to thank the Society of Friends. I love the name Conjuncta Florescit. It's actually very apropos of my talk this evening. I want to thank as well all the people who have facilitated my being here and this lecture this evening: Iris Lauterbach, Leah Kuhn, Ann-Kathrin Fischer, Lavinia Otters, Barbara Faltera, and all the people who helped set up this room tonight. And I also want to thank Stella Whiskrell for being a wonderful colleague to share an office with. And I hope many of you will come for her workshop next week, where she will present her exciting research. Abschließend möchte ich Folgendes sagen. Wie Sie alle wissen, war dies ein erst schwieriges Jahr für das akademische Leben in den USA. Für mich war die weinige Woche hier bereits eine wahre intellektuelle Zuflucht. Und ich kann Ihnen alle nicht genug für dieses Geschenk danken. So let me begin. Art history rarely asks small works of art to answer big questions. Works that are monumental in scale or reputation tend to drive the assessment of artists' careers, historical movements, or periods at large. Consider Hans Holbein the Younger's Tantalus, a drawing only 5.1 centimeters in diameter. This drawing has left almost no mark on the extensive literature about the artist, in part for a practical reason. It did not enter a public collection until 1998, and since then has been exhibited only twice. In greater part, its neglect reflects how much interpretations of Holbein's painted portraits dominate the historiography. Next to a painting like Holbein's Ambassadors, his Tantalus cannot but look like a minor work, even if both are equally and in their own ways enigmatic. Holbein's surviving oeuvre includes hundreds of drawings and designs for print, metalwork, stained glass, and architecture, which together far outnumber his paintings. The scale and diversity of his output should give us pause. These works across media all share at least two things in common. First, they show the extent to which Holbein went where opportunity led him, whether that meant a prominent public commission or a mock-up for a tiny jewel. Second, Holbein's works are never explicit revelations of his intentions or beliefs. In difference to Albrecht Dürer, a contemporary artist who left behind extensive writings about his art and enterprise, Holbein's sole surviving words are those he inscribed on his actual art. In this sense, too, he was opportunistic. Take the inscription on Holbein's Tantalus, a case of strategic design. Tantalus, read the letters on the banderole that winds around a fruit tree's arching trunk. The breaks in the name punctuate its first two syllables, but cut through the last. The hiss of that final isolated S captures the condition of Tantalus's slow torment. The waters surrounding him recede from his lips, and the fruits above pull away from his labored attempt to reach for them. As Homer first recounted in the Odyssey, Tantalus was a son of Zeus, condemned to perpetual hunger and thirst for serving the flesh of his son Pelops to the gods. The letter S stands out for another reason as well. Holbein repeats its forms in the waves, in Tantalus's hair, in the bend of the shore, and in the banderole itself. And as the letter S disengages from the others, it invites new readings. It is almost possible to reassemble the available letters and form the Latin words solace for well-being and satis for enough, both obviously paradoxical given Tantalus's condition. No matter how one reads the inscription, however, Tantalus's most profound choice was to put Holbein's most profound choice was to put Tantalus's name out of Tantalus's own reach. The artist locates the crux of his subject's punishment in the loss of identity. To be insatiate is to be only that and nothing else. There are many questions that follow from this analysis. How did Holbein come to his understanding of Tantalus's story? Did he know any Latin? Who would have appreciated the wit of this drawing? What was it made for? Only some of those questions can be answered, and I will address them in a moment, but they remain small questions. My larger aim in putting pressure on this drawing is to revisit a fundamental problem of the Northern Renaissance. The problem is defining the extent to which art and intellectual culture intersected in 16th century Northern Europe, and to understand the conditions that made their intersection possible. To pursue this problem is to consider the personal and professional alliances that brought an artist like Holbein into contact with ideas that were mostly expressed in Latin texts and within relatively closed circles. More significantly, it is to ask what an artist like Holbein stood to gain by making art that engaged with those ideas in the first place. In my title, I refer to Holbein's margins in more than one sense. I will be investigating the site where the artist's alliances with scholars were the most direct, the printed borders that he designed for books at Johannes Froben's publishing house in Basel during the 1510s and 1520s. These are Holbein's literal margins, and they are the result of collaborations that happened on the print shop floor. More broadly, I am interested in the artist's profit margin, by which I mean less what Holbein earned from his designs than the other ways his association with Froben's press benefited him. The techniques that Holbein learned at the margins of humanist production had their own kind of value, which accrued in his later career. In the terms of the period, my focus is on how Holbein's ingenium, which is to say his natural talent for invention, developed in direct response to the circumstances in which he was compelled to apply it. I chose Holbein's Tantalus as a starting point for this reason. I take the drawing to exemplify skills that the artist first honed in his formative years as a designer for print in Basel. These skills include Holbein's ability to convey the essence of a character or story with a great economy of means. They include his ability to create a visual field that accommodates text without resorting to the mere illustration of a text. Finally, they include a use of line that feels at once precise and unlabored, a graphic dynamism that supersedes color as a driving force. One might recall here the famous encomium that the Renaissance scholar Desiderius Erasmus wrote about Albrecht Dürer, describing how the artist used, quote, the most felicitous lines to depict wonders of nature, character, and emotion in only black and white. Yet to evoke Erasmus in order to explain something about a Renaissance artist is to immediately fall into a trap. Part 1, the Erasmian trap. If I have anything in common with this lecture's namesake, it is an abiding fascination with Erasmus. When Erwin Panofsky's acolyte William Heckscher described him as a true representative of the dignitas Erasmiana, it was not idle praise. Panofsky constructed his art history of the Northern Renaissance with a keen attention to what the textual record did and did not provide. From his dissertation on Albrecht Dürer's theoretical writings to his analysis of the hidden symbolism in early Netherlandish painting, he sought to demonstrate that Northern European art had experienced a Renaissance as articulate as that of Italy. At the same time, Panofsky did not mistake equality for equivalence. To comprehend an artistic tradition that had considerably less to say about itself, at least in the form of written art theory, required taking the absence of certain kinds of evidence seriously. It also required a certain amount of reading between the lines. Panofsky's article, Erasmus in the Visual Arts, which was published 1 year after his death in 1969, confronts these challenges in relation to an individual who was, next to Martin Luther, the most prominent thinker of the 16th century. Erasmus had abandoned a quiet monastic life in the Netherlands to become the first truly international scholar of early modern Europe. He wrote on faith, folly, war, marriage, language, and just about every other aspect of humanity. He commissioned art, albeit exclusively portraits of himself, and he put words to describing those works. Looking to his writings as a source on the art of the Renaissance seems an obvious move. Yet, as Panofsky observes, what Erasmus wrote about art was mostly in the service of making other claims. He condemned image worship in order to say something about what true spirituality looked like. He ridiculed the erection of public monuments as yet another example of human folly. He mocked a portrait for not quite capturing his likeness because his words offered the better portrait anyway. When he praised Dürer's graphic abilities, he did so in order to exercise his knowledge of ancient writings about art, and perhaps, as Panofsky ultimately suggests, to make a little jab at Dürer in the process. All these written comments reflect back on Erasmus's own patterns of thought, but the crucial thing is this: they say very little about how a Renaissance artist might have thought with him. Panofsky was aware of this issue too. Already in his study of Albrecht Dürer, he laid the groundwork for another approach to connecting Erasmus to the visual arts. He did so by positing an instance of Dürer engaging with Erasmus's writings. Panofsky's now canonical argument is that Dürer's Night, Death, and the Devil should be understood at least in part as a visual response to Erasmus's treatise, Instructions for a Christian Soldier. This analysis has endured because it goes some way toward explaining an engraving that does not adhere to any pre-existing iconography. Yet Panofsky's argument about Night, Death, and the Devil also had an effect he did not intend. It licensed the transformation of Erasmus into an adjective in the art historical literature. An Erasmian work of art could now be anything from a painting of the church father St. Jerome, whose writings Erasmus had edited, to a painting of a fool seen to parallel the eponymous character in Erasmus's famous satire, The Praise of Folly. The term's application is based on the assumption that Erasmus's writings sufficiently permeated 16th century culture to make a broad and diverse impact on artists whose knowledge of those writings could only have come secondhand. Even Dürer had, at best, only a little Latin. Erasmian is a word that Panofsky never used to describe a work of art. I suspect that it would have seemed to him as imprecise as it does to me. But Panofsky was more indulgent when it came to Holbein. Holbein occupies a special place in the historiography on Erasmus and the visual arts because the two men are documented to have known each other. We know that they met in Basel and that Erasmus wrote letters of recommendation to friends in Antwerp and England on his behalf. We know that Holbein went on to paint some of the scholar's most famous portraits, which have always seemed to capture the essence of the scholar himself. We have Erasmus's occasional remarks about Holbein in his letters, where praise for the artist meets frustration with his insufficient show of gratitude for Erasmus's support. All of this evidence led Panofsky to declare that Erasmus and Holbein completely understood, but perhaps for this very reason, did not wholeheartedly respect each other. Or as Panofsky put it more succinctly in his monograph on Dürer, Erasmus belonged not to Dürer, but to Hans Holbein. As an exercise, let us take Holbein's Tantalus once again as an example. We might look to Erasmus's Adages, his famous collection of commentaries on classical and vernacular proverbs, which was frequently printed and widely impactful in the 16th century. Erasmus's compendium includes an analysis of the adage, The Punishment of Tantalus, which reads as follows: "The torments of Tantalus is to be used by those who have good things within reach, but are forbidden to enjoy them. Gregory of Nazianzus, in a letter to Basel, turns this elegantly to apply to the delights of the world, which never satisfy the mind." Turning back to the drawing, we might suppose that it was made to appeal to the kind of person who upheld the pursuits of the intellect over the pursuit of worldly pleasures. Perhaps it was a design for a small hat badge, given its shape and scale. Worn outwardly on the body, we might speculate that such a badge would serve to reflect, by opposition, the inner qualities of its wearer. Hat badges often seem to operate this way in contemporary paintings. The old man in Jan Gossart's elderly couple wears a badge depicting a pair of naked youths who stand in amusing contrast to Gossart's aging subjects. Erasmus, especially in his praise of folly, modeled the idea of self-representation through one's antithesis. There's wit in revealing oneself obliquely through what one is not. Yet Holbein's drawing, whatever its purpose, seems to me a self-sufficient expression of the insight that Erasmus articulates. Neither its design by Holbein nor its appreciation by whomever engages with it depends on a knowledge of Erasmus's words, any more than understanding Erasmus's words depends on a knowledge of the drawing. Erasmus did not conceive of his commentaries on the adages as fixed points of reference in the first place. As he wrote in the preface to the expanded edition of the adages published in 1508, a proverb should be accommodated to its times and circumstances. And as Aldus Manutius, the great Venetian printer-publisher of this edition, echoed on his title page, the virtue of adages is that they, quote, can be accommodated to various uses. Both Holbein's drawing and Erasmus's commentary interpret the same proverbial kernel of wisdom, but each is differently adapted to its time, circumstance, and its maker's chosen medium. To the extent that Erasmus and Holbein understood each other, they did not do so through the written word. They did so through the social connections that brought them into proximity. Those connections were to Johannes Froben and the people who worked with and around him. Part 2, an opportune moment. The story of how Holbein became a designer of margins begins with his move to Basel, where he became active around 1515. Basel had been a hub for scholarly publishing since the late 15th century. This university town in the Rhineland was well connected to other parts of Europe, and most importantly to France, which dominated the early book market in Northern Europe. Local paper mills established in the region beginning in the mid-15th century provided the emerging print industry with ready access to its raw material. Most relevant for Holbein, Basel was also an early center for illustrated books. A landmark example is the Basel University professor Sebastian Brandt, who had published both his illustrated Virgil and famous Ship of Fools there by 1500, the latter with woodcuts designed by the young Albrecht Dürer. Basel was as sensible a place for an artist to seek work as it was for Johannes Froben to open shop. Froben was nonetheless an unlikely figure to have become a significant printer-publisher of Renaissance scholarship. He came up through the ranks at the press of his Basel precursor, Johann Amerbach, which gave him a knowledge of the trade, but not all the attendant credentials. A comparison to Aldus Manutius makes his limitations clear. Aldus was a scholar whose books were defined as much by the innovation of their beautiful Roman type and small-scale format as by his careful editing of both Latin and Greek texts. Erasmus was drawn to publish his expanded edition of the Adages in Venice because he could count on Aldus's knowledge. By contrast, Froben could not edit classical texts. He never studied at university and did not have the requisite languages. A telling note that Erasmus wrote atop a letter to Froben in 1518, a letter that he did not deign to write in the vernacular, commands its recipient, read this letter with Beatus, or anyone who knows Latin. Erasmus was not famous for his generosity. The impetus behind Erasmus's decision to move to Basel and join forces with Froben thus requires some explanation. In 1513, Froben published an unauthorized edition of the Adages, having acquired Erasmus's latest updated manuscript through a back channel. Although unauthorized editions of Erasmus's works were common, this one was better than most. First, Froben followed trend and imitated Aldus's use of Roman type. And you can see Aldus's Adages on top and Froben's on the bottom. Second, and more unconventionally, Froben used a new printed border designed for the edition's title page by the Swiss artist Urs Graf, whose work in Basel preceded Holbein's own. Printed title borders had featured on occasion in prior French and German publications, often with grotesque designs that vaguely evoke the antique and harken back to earlier Italian models. It was more typical in the period, however, for a printer's device to accompany the title as a straightforward advertisement of a book's origins. The device of Jos Bad, one of Erasmus's early publishers in France, actually depicts the working of a press. Aldus's own title pages included at most his emblem of a dolphin entwined around an anchor, which stood for his motto, Festina lente, or make haste slowly, a scholar's approach to promoting his industry. The title border designed for the adages distinguishes itself from this tradition because it is communicative rather than merely decorative or proprietary in function. Within its unified architectural frame unfolds a message conveyed by three main actors. At the border's summit, a female personification of humanitas reads a book, while the figures of Kairos and Nemesis flanking the central text suggest that one should indeed make haste slowly. The little god Kairos, with his winged feet, stands for alighting to seize the opportune moment. The watchful goddess Nemesis, on the right, stands ready to punish the hubris that comes from trying to seize that moment too quickly. Successful scholarly enterprise, the border suggests, meant finding the middle path between the two. Yet Graff's other border designs are far less complex than this one, with ornamental columns, putti, or the occasional stock fool, and it seems unlikely the artist conceived this one on his own. Froben is unlikely to have come up with the border's conceit either, for the reasons already mentioned. So if someone else did, then who? In 1887, the Swiss art historian Salomon Fauchelin published an article arguing that a scholar named Beatus Renanus had devised both the border of the unauthorized adages, as well as several of Holbein's later border designs. This is the same Beatus to whom Erasmus referred Froben for help with Latin and who had moved to Basel in 1511. Basel came up in the world by working as a corrector in the Parisian book scene. He and Erasmus were established friends, united by their mutual commitment to rigorous textual scholarship. Knowing that Beatus edited Froben's unauthorized adages probably drew Erasmus to Basel more than anything else. Upon his arrival in September 1514, Erasmus wrote that he initially saw no one, quote, except the men I really wanted to see, and that Beatus was the first among them. Erasmus proceeds in the same letter to describe how he duped Froben the first time he met him by pretending to be someone else. Erasmus's biases are clear, but as yet, Beatus's role conceiving designs for print is not. Fauchelin's argument about Beatus was polemical in its time, even if it does not seem so now. He was contending with Alfred Woltmann's Holbein und seine Zeit, a major monograph published a decade earlier in 1874, which states unequivocally that Holbein read and interpreted Erasmus's Latin texts himself. Woltmann's argument was presumptive and error-ridden. Fauchelin's own evidence was circumstantial. This kind of impasse goes some way toward accounting for the subsequent popularity of the adjective Erasmian in art historical literature. It is easier to put everything under one umbrella than to deal with the uncertainties of who actually did what. Another problem is how readily conjectures become fact. Recent scholarship still asserts without evidence that Holbein read Latin, and the latest monograph on Froben declares unequivocally that Beatus used Graff's title border to lure Erasmus to Basel. Never mind that within Erasmus's vast correspondence, there is not a single mention of a printed title border, but there are countless comments about good and bad editing. Erasmus cared about Beatus's skills with classical texts, not about his putative role designing visual programs. All that said, the title border for Froben's unauthorized edition of the adages was the start of something. It set a precedent for the borders that Holbein would begin to design for Froben and other printers in Basel just a few years later. Borders that are also communicative, but which are never illustrations of the books themselves. Borders were designed to be reused across more than one publication, which meant they had to be adaptable rather than specific. They became part of the print shop stock. In fact, Froben also used Graff's border with Humanitas, Kairos, and Nemesis simultaneously in 1513 for another publication. At their best, these borders are commentaries of a sort, but indirect ones, because they comment not on a particular text, but instead on the very nature of humanist enterprise. Printed borders became a new site of opportunity for talking about the collaborative business of producing and printing scholarship. Part 3, a living on the edge. At Froben's press, Holbein was among the least important people in the room. It is actually notable that the earliest known page border he designed includes his name at all. First printed in 1516 and frequently reused, the border is fairly traditional for the genre. Within an architectural niche, an assemblage of spirited putti trumpet, guard, and help to support the unfurling text pinned up like a banner at center. Two putti also support a shield at the bottom, featuring Holbein's printer's device, which he debuted not long after Erasmus's arrival in Basel. What the putti insistently ignore are the letters that spell Hans Holbein, present on two little plaques in the border's upper corners. The authors and their titles come first, Froben second, and Holbein last. Every other border that Holbein designed in Basel omits his name altogether for reasons that are straightforward to explain. Holbein did not cut his designs himself, but relied on blockcutters like Hans Lutzelberger, his most famous collaborator. And I'm showing you here one of Lutzelberger's most incredible woodcuts, which is so refined it could be mistaken for an engraving. Expert professionals like Lutzelberger were generally paid some 15 times more for their work than the artists who produced the designs, and for good reason. The only payment records that survive from Froben's shop date to the years after his death, when his son took over the press. They include payments to block cutters, but not a single payment to a draftsman. A certain Formschneider named Zacharias Spechtelin was paid more than an indexer in the accounts of 1559, but still less than the typesetters and the men who worked the press. The fact that block cutters controlled the final product also meant that they controlled who got credit on the page. Lutzelberger, a savvy self-promoter, exemplifies this practice in his woodcut, The Alphabet of Death. The print advertises Lutzelberger's name, his professional status as Formschneider, and his skillful cutting of Holbein's drawings at postage stamp scale. Holbein is present in the design alone, and even there he owed Lutzelberger a debt. Every letter exemplifies Lutzelberger's crisp execution of Holbein's plays on form. In the letter S, sinister details like the S-shaped worm in the mouth of the skeleton who is fondling a woman's private parts, or the curve of the other skeleton's exposed derriere, would be all but illegible if entrusted to a lesser hand. Even before he began designing for Froben, Holbein was navigating the margins of scholarship in Renaissance Basel. His earliest known works are drawings in a copy of Erasmus's Praise of Folly, printed by Froben in 1515 and owned by the Basel schoolmaster Oswald Myconius. Holbein likely made them in the same year the book was published, when he was just 18 years old. In the volume's front matter, Myconius inscribed a one-sentence account of the book's history. This folly, which was illustrated in 10 days, Erasmus held so that he could take delight in it. Myconius insists on two things: that Erasmus saw and enjoyed the illustrated volume, and that the illustrations were completed in rapid time. Given that Erasmus himself claimed to have written the Praise of Folly in a mere week, Myconius's emphasis on duration seems a deliberate flourish. But about Holbein, Myconius says nothing at all. Of course, Myconius knew who made the drawings, and it seems logical to assume that he was involved in their making too. Myconius was in the business of explaining things. Holbein was in the business of representing things. Each of them brought something to the table. Consider Holbein's depiction of God warning Adam about the tree of knowledge. Folly explains in Erasmus's text that this warning amounted to God saying that, quote, knowledge was poisonous to happiness, scientia felicitate sit venenum. In the drawing, we see God take Adam's wrist with one hand, like a schoolteacher scolding a naughty pupil, while his other hand points upward. Holbein's middle-aged Adam looks disconsolate as he attempts a feeble reply. But what lesson is Adam meant to learn? Holbein's God seems to point more toward the text than the tree, specifically to the word peccatum for sin within the printed commentary alongside Erasmus's words. In fact, the tree's execution in comparably thicker pen strokes and heavier ink may even suggest that it was not planned from the start. God's indexical gesture recalls a maniple, the most basic form of marginal visual annotation, and it answers Folly's interpretation of Genesis with a playful rebuttal, a comment on the very act of commentating. And here, for comparison, is a maniple penned by Erasmus himself in one of his own manuscripts. The scenario behind Holbein's drawings in Myconius's Folly helps us to reconstruct what happened at Froben's press. It makes sense to think that Holbein devised his designs in collaboration with others. Likewise, it makes sense to think that once he completed a design, he handed it over and moved on, rather than taking part in the specialized transfer process. The Formschneider would transform it into a print to be used and reused as the printer publisher and his co-workers determined. In the same way, Myconius spent much more time with Holbein's drawings than the artist ever did. He continued his written annotations around them and added personal reflections in response to them. He may even have used them in his teaching of pupils. These circumstances must not have troubled Holbein. Other commissions in Basel were keeping him busy and paid. Something else about this marginal work was to his advantage. Part 4, Lessons on Alliance. It is a commonplace to think about margins as sites of conversation in manuscripts. What happens if we think about the printed borders at Froben's press as sites of conversation too? Because of their circulation and reuse, the conversations that happened around these borders were surely heterogeneous and are harder to reconstruct. In that light, I want to offer an example that allows us to consider the immediate discourse around their making. In 1521, the press published one of Beatus Renanus's most significant works to date, the Editio Princeps of the early Christian author Tertullian. The book's title border came from the existing stock of Froben's press, where it first adorned a 1518 edition of the Roman historian Suetonius. But the border on the book's next page was new and designed by Holbein for this volume. It serves to frame Beatus's dedicatory letter to Stanislaus Thurzo, Bishop of Olmütz and a friend of Erasmus. Unusually, Froben never reused this border, not even for the second edition of Tertullian, published in 1528. Its one-time use cannot be explained by a connection to Tertullian's writings. Its subject is not theological, it is the punishment of Tantalus. The border takes up the narrative at the moment when Tantalus's crime is found out. The gods Mercury and Jupiter, two of the guests at Tantalus's gruesome dinner party, gesture down from the border's upper segment toward the guilty party. In the middle segment, Tantalus acknowledges his guilt as he points down toward Pelops's mutilated body at his feet. Across the page, Ceres is restoring the arm of the poor boy she had inadvertently eaten for dinner. Between these scenes, Beatus writes in his dedicatory letter to Stanislaus about the need to restore ancient texts that have been, quote, corrupted or deformed by the injuries of time, inuria temporum depravatos. It is impossible to say whether Beatus intended a parallel between Ceres' restoration of Pelops and his own scholarly efforts, but the juxtaposition is intriguing, if a little macabre. Another suggestive moment of contact occurs at the bottom of the page. Two fruit trees curve down in symmetry to taunt Tantalus's hunger as he paddles in the unquenching waters around him. The tops of the trees are cut off and located instead at the page's summit, which has led past interpreters to denounce this border as a botched job. However, we have to keep in mind that Beatus was there on the floor of Froben's shop, correcting errors and guiding layout, especially for publications he cared about. In the text adjacent to the scene of torment, Beatus made a decision. He insisted on getting the word angustia onto the recto of the page, rather than saving it for the verso. Beatus is apologizing to Stanislaus for the brevity of his letter, Epistolaris Angustia, which does not allow him space to enumerate the bishop's many virtues. The apology is rhetorical, since the letter is not brief at all. Both this fact and the isolation of angustia in the lower right corner open up consideration of the word's other meanings, which include difficulty and distress, as well as scarcity and want. The final A in angustia droops a little. The fact that the final A in angustia droops a little aligns it still further with the arching trees in Holbein's design. As Beatus tempts Stanislaus with what else he might have written in praise, Tantalus suffers from wants that will not be satisfied. This juxtaposition seems more than coincidental. Yet the strangest detail of the entire page transpires within the margin alone and at the site of Tantalus's condemnation. Here, Tantalus's upturned head and the evident futility with which he expresses himself in the face of the god's judgment, his open mouth, his gesturing hands, are hallmarks of Holbein's ability to embody and condense a narrative moment. We have seen the same strategies in his figure of Adam from Myconius's Folly and in his later drawing of Tantalus. Between Tantalus's arms, at the juncture of the hubris Holbein conveys so well, hangs a plaque that bears both the protagonist's name and the initials IF. Who would choose to put their monogram here, of all places? The initials belong to Jakob Faber, a specialist in metal cutting, who, like Lutzelberger, executed several of Holbein's border designs and who consistently monogrammed his work. You can see another example here in the lower left corner. Metal cutting was an experimental medium, far more rarefied than woodcut, but its use for book borders had precedent in France, where Faber trained, and more rarely in early Italian books. The technique can result in lines that are slightly finer than those of woodcut, with more gray tone between black and white. And you can see a detail here from one of Faber's rare surviving metal blocks. The only person who could produce woodcuts of equivalent refinement in Renaissance Basel was Hans Lutzelberger, who set a standard in his medium that others could not attain. And it may be that Faber was recruited to Basel for this reason. We know Faber's name from a letter sent to Beatus in 1516. His correspondent asked that Beatus, quote, greet Jakob Faber, sculptor of metal, and describes Faber as a member of Froben's extended family. However, prior to the 19th century resurrection of this letter, it was assumed that the initials IF belonged not to the block cutter, but to Johannes Froben. The confusion is warranted. In fact, that is exactly what I thought when I first saw this border. Although not all the borders made for Froben's press included his printer's device, many of them place it along the lower edge, precisely where Tantalus's head is located here. This is a case in which thinking about what is not there may change how we see what is there. The scene of Tantalus's torment and its symmetry shares a certain affinity with Froben's device. The curving branches recall the winding serpents, with Tantalus situated between them. To assess whether this connection is far-fetched requires a closer look at the device itself and what it was understood to mean. Froben's printer's mark was itself designed in deliberate affinity with that of Aldus Manutius. The device was a way for Froben to affirm his status as Erasmus's next great publisher. The image of the caduceus, the staff of the enterprising god Mercury, responds both to the form and message of Aldus's dolphin entwined around an anchor. The only distinctive addition to Froben's device is the bird perched at its summit. In his famous discussion of the Aldine adage, Festina lente, Erasmus compares the two devices. He identifies the bird as a dove with reference to a line from the book of Matthew, be as shrewd as serpents and as innocent as doves. By this account, Froben's device embodies the idea of holding outward industry and inner virtue in balance. However, A copy of Erasmus's Adages, owned by the Lutheran theologian Philippe Melanchthon, emphasizes a different interpretation of the device. This copy of the 1539 edition is filled with Melanchthon's careful annotations of the text. He even inscribed a charming reminder to himself on the book's title page: "Beware never to let slip from your hands Erasmus's Adages and Copia." He was a fan. Melanchthon also intervened within Froben's device at the center of the title page, adding his own gloss on the symbol. Within the neck of one of the snakes, he penned the Latin phrase, "Foedera non rompenda," or alliances should not be broken. Following the trail of Melanchthon's annotations in the book reveals the source of the line. Beside the discussion of Froben's device in Erasmus's commentary on Festina Lente, Melanchthon expressed dissatisfaction through a laconic cross-reference. "The symbol of Froben is explained later," he writes, and gives another folio number. His reference takes us to Erasmus's commentaries on the adage, "the Cassius knot," which includes the following excursus. "On the caduceus, Mercury's wand, there are two serpents, male and female, twisted together in the middle of their bodies to make a Hercules knot. It was from them, I imagine, that Johannes Froben borrowed his mark. He, the most industrious of our modern printers, and a man who has laid students of sacred literature under the greatest debt. The only difference is that outside the circle formed by the serpents as they bring their heads together, he has added a dove that sits on the wand. This knot was consecrated to Mercury by the Egyptians to indicate that alliances once made should never be broken, but should retain great strength." Embedded within this commentary by Erasmus, we find the concept that Melanchthon adapted in his annotation on the device. The crucial thing by Melanchthon's interpretation was not the balance of dove versus serpent. Instead, it was the knot itself. The Aldine dolphin swims alone in measured haste. By contrast, Froben's serpents and dove are engaged in the mutual work of maintaining their bond. Alliance and industry together are key to the strength of Froben's enterprise. This notion of alliance resonates when we carry it over to the border with the punishment of Tantalus. Tantalus broke faith with the gods when he attempted to deceive them into consuming his son's body. Nemesis followed his hubris and led to his eternal punishment. In the years when this border was made, Beatus was growing increasingly concerned about the mounting ideological fissures of the Reformation, which directly impacted the press. Froben had decided to start publishing the writings of Martin Luther a few years prior. This was a good business move because Luther's writings sold extremely well, but it caused Erasmus displeasure and put Beatus in the middle. Erasmus had come to Basel because Froben had put his print shop on the map as the Northern European counterpart to the Aldine Press, a center for the publishing of restored editions of classical and Christian texts, precisely like Beatus's edition of Tertullian. Luther's tracts were something else entirely, and you can see they even look different. These tracts were driven by the fierce desire to articulate a new theological doctrine in the present. They were about Luther and Lutheranism, rather than a commitment to the broad expansion of humanistic knowledge. It seems possible that Beatus, Faber, and Holbein collaborated to create a border with an embedded warning to Froben, a reminder that bad things happen when you forget to honor your alliances. What better place to put such a warning than a book that in its collaborative creation modeled how important alliances were. Holbein's border makes much more sense as a comment on the enterprise of publishing than it does as an attempt to use a mythological story to comment on a Christian author's writings. What little past scholarship exists on these printed borders has tried and failed to take a strictly iconographical approach to them, assuming a one-to-one connection between text and image. I have made an attempt instead to understand these margins as sites of human connection, because that seems to me a more valid approach, even if it can never be conclusive. So let me summarize with what we can say with certainty. First, the people who accommodated these borders to various uses at Froben's press were the people laboring on the ground. In the case of the Tertullian edition, Beatus happened to be the author, editor, and corrector, but in most other cases, the author had no real role in the process. Printed borders were places for the people who did the physical work of bringing books to fruition, drawing, cutting, correcting, to talk about the work that they did together. At times, even Froben had to cede the floor to the men on whom he relied. Second, these borders, like Erasmus's commentaries on Proverbs, are not programmatic but playful. They both require and reward close looking. I would argue that this quality, above all, made designing them an appealing venture for Holbein. To exercise wit in dialogue with others whose expertise was different from his own was a form of continuing education. It was an education that the artist increasingly understood that he would need. As the Reformation encroached on Basel, dampening public commissions and economic stability, Holbein was training himself for the next act. Part 5, conclusion. Holbein's drawing of Tantalus is plausibly dated to the last years of his life, sometime in the later 1530s. By this point, Holbein was ensconced at the English court under the patronage of King Henry VIII. In addition to fulfilling prestige portrait commissions, he spent his time making designs for precious jewels and other goldsmith work, as well as drawing for occasional prints like his famous title border for the Coverdale Bible. The usual argument for continuity between Holbein's work in Basel and in England centers on his mastery of the antique mode, which was popular in both locales. But there is another way to look at this body of work. Holbein had gone from designing for the margins of humanist books to designing for the margins of courtly bodies, where there was also opportunity for play. In his portrait drawing of William Parr, Holbein captured the face, but also planned various accoutrements. A pendant design and several little pins, including one that seems to be labeled Death, hover in the upper corner, waiting to bounce off and around the individual at center. And what is the anamorphic skull in Holbein's Ambassadors, if not the ultimate border design, one that refuses to be read in direct relation to the double portrait at center? But I began this talk by saying that art history rarely asks small works of art to answer big questions, and that is where I want to end. I do not know why Holbein went back to the punishment of Tantalus years later and represented it again. Perhaps the subject reoccurred to him for a specific commission or just as a good demonstration piece, an example of what he knew how to do. What it demonstrates centuries later is his participation in a much larger enterprise. To understand the connection between art and humanism in the Northern Renaissance, we have to get past Erasmus and pay attention to the many kinds of connections that an artist like Holbein found in a collective like Froben's publishing house. For Holbein, Desiderius Erasmus was neither the impetus nor even the direct inspiration for his designs. Works like the Adages or the Praise of Folly modeled modes of indirection and illusion that were generative because they were adaptable well beyond the written page. By putting these models into broad circulation, Erasmus did not create a doctrine to follow. Rather, he simply created a condition of opportunity. Thank you.